This segment of the Chapter 11 lecture is titled Life Under Slavery, and the focus question is, what were the legal and material constraints on slaves' lives and work? For slaves, slavery meant incessant toil, harsh punishment, and constant fear that their families would be destroyed by sale. Slaves were the legal property of their owners. Their few legal rights were rarely enforced. Slaves could be bought and sold by their owners at will and had no voice in the governments that ruled over them. They could not testify in court against whites, sign contracts or buy property, own firearms, hold meetings apart from whites, or leave a farm or plantation without permission. By the 1830s, it was illegal to teach slaves how to read and write. Although these laws were not always enforced, the entire Southern legal and governmental system was designed to enforce the slave master's control over the slaves' bodies and labor. During the early 19th century, some Southern states passed laws to prevent slave mistreatment, and their material conditions did improve. Many slaves supplemented the food owners provided by raising crops and livestock, gathering, and even hunting. They had better diets than slaves in the West Indies and Brazil. Paternalism contributed to slaves' material improvements over time, and the increasing price of slaves encouraged planters to care for their slaves' basic well-being. These improved conditions, however, were hardly intended to weaken slavery, but rather to strengthen it through the protection of economic investments. Yet slavery was tightened in this period, and states passed laws making it harder for owners to free their slaves or for slaves to buy their own freedom. Slavery helped define the status of free blacks. By the Civil War, 500,000 free blacks lived in the United States, the majority in the South. While whites defined their freedom by their distance from slavery, free blacks were not radically different than enslaved blacks. In most of the North, free blacks could not vote and had few economic opportunities. In the South, free blacks could own their own property, could marry, and could not be bought or sold as slaves, but they had virtually no other rights in Southern society. They could not own dogs, guns, or liquor, could not strike whites, even in self-defense, and had to carry proof of their free status. In other American slave societies, where racial identity was less sharply distinguished, free blacks amassed property and prestige. In the United States, the sharp racial distinction between black and white left little room for a mulatto class to emerge. By 1860, very few of the South's free blacks lived in the lower South, and those who did were mostly in cities. In New Orleans and Charleston, however, large free black communities existed, and while most were craftsmen, a few became quite wealthy. They established their own churches and schools. In the upper South, where most Southern free blacks lived, they worked mostly for wages as farm labor. Some free blacks there even owned slaves. Slavery was above all a labor system, in which work occupied the entirety of slaves' time, except for brief meals. On large plantations, slaves performed all kinds of work, from labor in the fields to skilled labor like carpentry, engineering, and shoemaking. Slaves also worked on steamboats, in mines, in seaports, and on railroads. Local authorities used them to build roads and other facilities, and the federal government used them to build forts and other public buildings. Professionals such as merchants, lawyers, and businessmen used slaves, and by the Civil War, 200,000 slaves worked in industries such as ironworks and tobacco factories. In southern cities, slaves were used as unskilled labor and skilled artisans. A few slaves were entrusted with great responsibilities, such as supervising other slaves, selling goods, or handling money. Most slaves, perhaps as many as 75% of women and 90% of men, worked in the fields. The organization of their work varied according to the crop and the size of the holding. On small farms, slaves worked alongside their owner. The largest concentration of slaves worked on plantations in the Cotton Belt in gangs, directed by an overseer and maybe a slave driver. Overseers tasked with producing large crops were often brutal. Slaves who worked sugarcane in southern Louisiana also worked in gangs in the harshest working conditions in the South. Slaves who worked on rice plantations in South Carolina and Georgia engaged in task labor without supervision and had free time for the day if they finished their daily task. From the slave's perspective, slavery in different regions of the South could be worse in some respects and better in others. Slaves in rice fields faced harsh conditions but had more independence than other slaves because of task labor and the absence of a large white population. Skilled urban slave craftsmen had great autonomy and often could hire themselves out and sometimes even keep their earnings. Many urban slaves even lived by themselves. By the 1850s, most slave owners began to remove urban slaves to the country, fearing that their independence was eroding the relationship between master and slave. Slavery was based on force. Slave owners used a variety of methods to maintain order and discipline and persuade slaves to work productively. Masters could inflict almost any kind of punishment, and it was the rare slave who was not whipped at some point in his or her life. Even minor infractions invited whipping. Owners used subtler methods, too. They exploited divisions among the slaves, especially between field hands and house servants. They created incentives for hard work, such as time off or even cash payments. The threat of sale was the most powerful weapon owners had, since sale disrupted families and slave communities.